There were several things I think that joined your papers, but I thought the most important thing were the three distinct approaches that you all took in rethinking this idea of what you mentioned, Melanie, solitary genius, and what historians have been telling us for over 50 years, Svetlana Alpers, T.J. Clark, Baxendale, to rethink the post-Renaissance master or genius. And not to bring it back to Wren, but I think we have to think about this idea of a network made by virtue of the institutional framework, made by the circumstances of post-fire building and culture, and the economy, is all indebted to these networks. And I think there are three principal things that I've recognized here. The importance of drawing, the importance of knowing the intellectual formation in an office, practical knowledge, but importantly, trust. And this word trust was used frequently in Wren's letters and Hawksmoor's letters. And I wanted to ask you all, in your opinion, how can we read buildings as a display or production of systems of trust in this period? And James, maybe...
This is a very interesting question, actually. And if we're talking about networks, the first thing I would say is the network we need to think about first and foremost is the court. Vanbrugh was a courtier. Everything that goes on in his life after he comes back from the East Indies is about pursuing a career within the framework of the court. That's the source of the positions of credit, profit, and ease that we are looking at, that Vanbrugh managed to acquire, whether it's heraldic or whether it's architectural or whether it's a surveyorship on the Crown estate. This is a system that is built on vertical rather than horizontal social solidarities. So it's about ties of mutual obligation. You give service to somebody, you are rewarded. That is a trust-based system. Trust is often under pressure, but that's the foundation of it. It's rooted in basically feudal conceptions of service. So if we want to understand some of these patterns of relationship, and that includes the relationship with Addison, by the way, because the reason why Vanbrugh is connected with Addison is because they have a common patron, Oliver. If we want to understand this, it is a system of vertical social solidarities, not a class system of the kind that we have.
But James, do you think that Vanbrugh considered himself a courtier? Did he value himself more as a courtier or an office holder?
I think the two things are the same thing. You're in personal service to the monarch, so you hold an office because you are in service to the monarch.
There are two different things. There's the formation of the state and government, and the office holding, and then the courtier is a different system. But maybe we can bring that up and talk about it. But I wonder, do you think that, how did he see himself
how are they different
professionally?
systems? How are they different systems?
They're very different systems. The formation of post-restoration states is a different kind of court system. But I wondered how Vanbrugh saw himself professionally. Did he see himself as the way we think of a courtier in the Jacobean sense, or in the post-restoration, Glorious Revolution sense of an office holder?
I would
suggest as well.
Yeah, I think that distinction might be.
What you think about the importance of trust in a position, a professional position, and where Vanbrugh saw
in the broader networks, or the idea of broader building networks of trust, for me, what's key is prior performance. You know, with actually executing a work, how can you trust somebody to do it right? You've seen they've done it before. And that actually problematizes a lot of Vanbrugh's works, because he didn't have prior performance experience. A lot of the individuals like Etty and Jones were young people who didn't have experience. Now, of course, there's old Mr. Strong, who's keeping the show in the road at Blenheim, but there's a lot of difficulty in that idea.
And ultimately a massive breakdown in trust with the client. I mean, it
Yeah.
happens all the time. And Hawksmoor is very denigratory about builders in London. Thinks a lot of charlatanism. And early 18th century literature is full of nasty comments about builders. And you don't think you have to look too far today for that. I mean, there's trust, but you're right.
Absolutely.
Like But that's why I think there's such a core in England at the time. You get the core around the building of St. Paul's, and the trust that comes out of that, even though, of course, there's moments where that breaks down, but the actual competence that comes out of building St. Paul's spreads. And, you know, at Blenheim, you've got young Christopher Cass, who eventually is going to take over, and then he goes on and, you know, St. Martin in the Fields and Houghton, and, you know, I mean, the skill spreads out from St. Paul's.
It's the I have a guy idea.
And I suppose what you were saying, you've got to bring it back to Wren.
Yes.
You know, it does really
He
begin with
instilled that. Yes, you must trust the people that you work with, know your materials, go to the quarry, know the stone, and above all, know how to draw. Although we don't know if, and we haven't mentioned the importance of the draftsman, Arthur. We haven't mentioned Arthur yet today, and how important it was for these men to have someone who could draw, because ultimately the role of a surveyor and a clerk of works was someone who could draw. What about that? How do you see those skills being exchanged between the network?
Well, we're missing a huge part of the picture in most instances, which is the working drawings.
Yeah.
In Lime Park, I think there's a few. Christine Casey talks about some of them in her new book. And, you know, those often one-to-one drawings that are on the building site, that must have gone down, you know, through Hawksmoor and down to Henry Jones and maybe down to the Strongs, and, I mean, disseminated amongst all the masons.
Strongs had drawing boards and, you know, materials on site in their office or sheds. So everyone was drawing.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
you know, the skilled.
They needed to, because the drawings were so difficult. You know, it was a labour-intensive process at this time to do photostated, stereoactive. And there's a wonderful correspondence at Blenheim where Hawksmoor says, get these drawings copied by the masons and then send them back to me, because I have no other copy.
Yeah.
And so it's a rare skill.
Precious things.
The fair copy and the foul copy, to use Shakespeare. And what about Archer? I mean, he was a really interesting. He was a true courtier to begin with.
Yeah,
A true courtier.
absolutely.
He was. Yep. And he. How do you see him moving within that sphere and gathering his own network?
I think, I mean, his is a perfect example of a whole career based on trust. I mean, he established these friendships, I would say, and, you know, because he wasn't quite at the same level as his patrons, but he was pretty close. So he could almost engage as an equal. And there would be, I think it's far more complex than we give it credit for. And there would have been this intellectual, gentlemanly discourse between landowners, you know, particularly at Chatsworth. I think, you know, Vanbrugh's, Archer's often very overlooked there. He actually did a hell of a lot of work there. You know, the Cascade House, he did the North Front, he potentially worked on the courtyard inside, perhaps tinkered with the West Front after Talman left as well. You know, he really picked up the pieces after Talman left. And, you know, that mark of trust that Duke of Devonshire gave to him and giving him that commission really skyrocketed his career. And as you were saying about what you've done before as the benchmark of what you can do in the future, that really came across with Archer. He established that trust with all his patrons. And I think really from the card tables at court, you can imagine him sketching on the back of a napkin, kind of, you know, as I'm sure we're all familiar with, I could design you that new wing, you know, that sort of attitude of, I can help you with that, it's fine.
Friends.
Yeah, exactly.
Much longer than Wren had been known. And again, the ghostly figure in the room is Wren, of course, who presides over all of this and is still very much alive and still active in this period, and threatens to come down to Blenheim, and Hawksmoor says, get your papers together, Wren's coming down, get organised. But here you still have someone who holds an intellectual accountability to everyone, intellectually and professionally. And Vanbrugh very clearly says when he thinks that the office might be in his hands, he says he couldn't take it because of tenderness for Sir Christopher, who was 87 at the time. But what is he still in peripheral view, or is he still in direct view of the network, and how so, do you think?
Well, at Chatsworth, famously, when the trust broke down there between Talman and the Duke, it's Sir Christopher who's called upon to survey the stone, and he sends, I think,
Three
Strong.
Strong and two others, yeah.
two others. And they have to, so it's that London expertise has to be sent up to see what's going on. And, so yeah, I think he's definitely, as you say, he's the shadow in the background the whole time.
I think architecturally with Archer and Wren, there's a very direct thread. Archer sort of very much uses brickwork in a tradition that I think goes right back to Wren, where he skillfully uses different tones of brick to imply different planes and different projections when actually it's a flat surface. And I think that is directly from Wren.
Yes, you do see that. And James, how does he preside over this coupling
In what sense?
as the master and as the surveyor general?
It's a very good question, a very difficult one, because there isn't much evidence of any direct interaction really between. Clearly, they were working together and they were attending regularly the Board of Works meetings. They must have been resolving issues on a daily basis. But there is competitiveness, because although Vanbrugh says that, there's absolutely no doubt that he is pursuing the surveyorship in a systematic way.
Yeah.
One of the things that I discovered in the course of my work on Blenheim was that the reason is that, contrary to myth, Vanbrugh was not being paid to design Blenheim. He gets money eventually by other means, but he's done a deal with the Duke of Marlborough. He will design the house for free if Marlborough gets him the surveyorship when Sir Christopher Wren. And this is again the court society, right? These are people doing deals. They trust each other more or less. And one of the reasons why everything gets so fraught at Blenheim is the deteriorating relationship between Vanbrugh and the Duchess leads him to fear that Vanbrugh to fear that he's not going to get the surveyor. So there's very kind of complicated competition. And when Vanbrugh is making rude comments about Christopher Wren's ability to keep control on perquisites, is that just an honest pursuit of better regulation in the office, or is it somebody stabbing somebody else in the back? This is very, very complicated. Honest Van, is that straightforward view of Vanbrugh, or is that irony? These people are complicated. They are competing for privileged positions which pay considerable amounts of money, attract a great deal of social prestige. This is not kindergarten.
Yeah.
It's a vicious
Positions
world.
of power, absolutely. And we've got just a couple of minutes before. Yes.
We're probably running short of time for questions, so
Yep,
if
we
anyone
can
has any
take
questions,
let's take a few questions before we've got tea coming. But let's have a couple. Rory. You can begin if you'd like.
maybe two, and then we'll go.
I'm coming back up strong in Team Vanbrugh, James. Something that's always puzzled me, which I don't really understand, and it may just be I haven't read the correct letters or haven't sort of found the right treasure trove, but it's if it is more of a collaboration between Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor, why is it that when the whole thing goes horribly wrong, that it seems to be Vanbrugh that's the one that gets the main flack? And I don't understand that.
Because Vanbrugh is the one that has direct contact with the clients.
Right.
So Vanbrugh is undoubtedly the person who is being trusted by the Duke of Marlborough to do his will. And he is the one who is in direct contact. But the thing that becomes clear at both Castle Howard and Blenheim, which is very interesting and not to be expected given the differential in social status between Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor, is the way that Hawksmoor becomes steadily more and more trusted by the clients as the projects go on. So Hawksmoor goes from being a draftsman at Castle Howard to being somebody who's engaged in independent design of major works at Castle Howard. At Blenheim, when the first big bust-up happens between Vanbrugh and the Duchess in late 1706, when she comes to see the site for the first time and she's absolutely horrified at what she sees, the response from the Duke of Marlborough is we hope that Mr. Hawksmoor can mend the faults that you've observed. So, the trust rises as people realise how incredibly competent he is. Competence triumphs in a sense. Trust is earned because he does what he does very well. So he comes out of the shadows in both of these projects over time and becomes increasingly prominent in the way the projects work until, of course, at Blenheim, he is the only person providing architectural advice to the Duchess herself, one of the most difficult characters in 18th century British history. And this is not an anti-feminist statement. It's just true. Even the Duke found it difficult to deal with her at times. So that would be my response.
That's excellent.